So welcome to this film and discussion series that is a joint project of Physicians for Social Responsibility, the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, and the Vermont International Film Festival. The purpose of the series is to educate ourselves about nuclear weapons, how they came to be, what they can do, and how we can eliminate the threat that they expose us to. For this first discussion, we've actually invited two audiences, those who registered for the movie discussions and those involved through the Women's International League that are in the middle of a commemoration of the first atomic testing, the founding of the UN, and the atomic bombings. And it's beginning with this program that's joint with our discussion tonight called Radioactive New Mexico. Our first film is about the atomic bomb and how it came to be through the eyes of those who made it. But before we talk about the creators of the bomb, we're actually going to hear from people who were on the receiving end of their work. So we're pretty excited to have special guests who have personal experience with nuclear war. Before the atomic bombs were dropped on Japan, they were tested on American soil and directly affected American citizens who were unknowing of what was going on at the time, unwillingly forced to take part, and despite many requests have not been adequately compensated. So Rob and Lloyd of WILPF will now introduce these ladies who will tell their stories, and after their presentations, questions and answers, we can go on to talk about the film and how that fits in as well. Robin?
Yes, okay, wonderful. I'm so glad that you all are here and the two groups are coming together. Yes, I am co-chair of the Disarm Committee of the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom. And I'm wearing this necklace of peace cranes in honor of the survivors of the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, who sent them to us to draw attention to the fact that this is the 75th anniversary of those events that changed their lives and our lives forever. So I hope most of you have seen the film, The Moment in Time. We thought that this would be a good introduction not only to the film series, which is going from Trinity to Nagasaki with 5 or 6 different films that you can watch with discussions afterwards, but that it would be sort of in commemoration of the Trinity bombing because it focuses entirely on the drive prior to Trinity to win the war and the commitment of scientists to solve the technical problems of refining uranium and making it fit into a little capsule so that it explodes at the right time. There's no discussion in the film of the environmental or health impact of this act of nuclear, what we call nuclear colonialism, insofar as the bomb was exploded in an area of many people who were not consulted. Its attitude of atomic justification shows why the messages of our speakers today need to be spread far and wide. Ellen Thomas, who is co-hosting this today, and I met Tina Cordova and Joni Arends at the gathering of Alliance for Nuclear Accountability in Washington, D.C. It's called ANA DC Days. It's a grassroots lobbying organization made up of community groups from around the country who have been impacted in some way by the nuclear fuel cycle and the nuclear weapons industry. It's a very eye-opening experience to take part in ANA, and I encourage you all to look into it and maybe come sometime when we're able to get together again in Washington. So Tina Cordova is a 6th generation New Mexican born and raised in the small town of Tularosa in south central New Mexico. In 2005, Tina co-founded the Tularosa Basin Downwinders Consortium. The mission of the consortium is to bring attention to the negative health effects suffered by the unknowing, unwilling, uncompensated, innocent victims of the first nuclear blast on Earth that took place at the Trinity site in south central New Mexico. She will tell us of the experiences of her family and neighbors and what they endured and how their demand for recompense is coming to a head now with their insistence on amending the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act, HR 3783, so that it includes the downwinders of the Trinity bombing. So Tina, please take the floor.
Thank you so much, Robin. And I am so grateful to be a part of this, this meeting that we're conducting tonight, so that I can sort of share my experiences with everybody who has joined and with everyone who might see this at some time in the future. I want to talk a little bit about the Trinity test and the uniqueness of the Trinity test and the lifestyles of the people in 1945, so that everybody has a better understanding of why the test was such a huge environmental disaster for the people of New Mexico. First of all, the Trinity test was never to be repeated. It was the only time that a bomb was detonated on a platform 100 feet off the ground. Then they learned from doing the test that they could never do a test like this again because of the amount of fallout that was produced. So you can imagine that there was this amazing blast that came down, intercepted the earth, took up an enormous amount of dirt, sand, animal and plant life, and went over 7 miles past the atmosphere into the stratosphere, incinerated everything because it produced more light and more heat from the sun, and then went, like I said, past the atmosphere into the stratosphere. For days afterwards, a radioactive ash fell. The bomb was incredibly inefficient. It was packed with 13 pounds of plutonium, but only 3 pounds were necessary for the fission process, which means that a full 10 pounds of plutonium that has a half-life of 24,000 years was part of that fireball that rose into the stratosphere. That ash that fell from the sky had other radioactive isotopes as part of it, but the plutonium was probably, because we know it's the most toxic substance known to man, was probably the thing that has always concerned us the most because of the half-life associated with plutonium. The other thing about the bomb that we have to recognize is how it impacted people's lifestyles. In 1945, in rural parts of New Mexico, those villages and communities surrounding Trinity, there was no running water. And this was July. July happens to be our rainy season. Joni mentioned earlier that we're kind of waiting on a rainstorm right now. Most of what we get in the way of precipitation takes place in our monsoon season, and July is absolutely our monsoon season. So if people don't have running water, they're relying on the rain that falls from the sky to charge up, to fill up their cisterns, the lakes, the rivers, the creeks, the ditches that was the source of their water, the water that they used for everything: drinking, bathing, cooking, doing laundry, cleaning, etc. Now all of that was contaminated, and obviously probably very much contaminated with plutonium. The other thing that in 1945 didn't exist in New Mexico, especially rural parts of New Mexico, is refrigeration. Some people had an ice box, and there was a booming ice business in the little town I grew up in, Tularosa. But nobody had a refrigerator, and there was no refrigeration at, for example, a grocery store. There weren't even grocery stores, there were mercantile stores. And what you most likely bought in 1945 at a mercantile was things like flour, sugar, coffee, rice, cereal, but you bought no meat, no produce, and no dairy there. All of those things were produced by yourself and by your family at home. So you probably had a cow or a goat for the purpose of milk, or there was a local dairy. And you probably had an orchard and a garden, and you probably raised cows, pigs, sheep, chickens, and for protein source for meat. And you probably also did a lot of hunting for small mammals and birds. July would have also been the peak of the harvest season for the people in New Mexico, when the women would have been gathering up everything that they could get their hands on and either drying it or canning it for the winter months. And now, after this radioactive ash fell from the sky, everybody's water sources, their entire environment, everything that they grew, raised, or hunted for food sources was impacted. The stories are pretty remarkable in the history of Trinity, and those stories clearly talk about the ash falling for days from the sky. They also talk about how there were cows that were grazing in the area that either had their hides burned off or turned white or half white. And so it's pretty well documented that there was this complete overexposure, for example. But what never happened, what was never part of the history, what's never happened since, is that there was never a warning given to the people that lived around there. We've identified families that had lived as close as 12 miles to the test site. And the village I grew up in is about 40 miles the way the crows fly from the test site. The other thing that we've learned in the most recent past is that there was a huge spike in infant mortality in the summer months after the Trinity test, after a 10-year decline in New Mexico in infant mortality, to coincide with the advent of, for example, antibiotics, hygienic practices, and even treatments used in medicine. There was a 10-year decline in infant mortality, and in the months after Trinity, we had this huge spike in infant mortality. So I say now, we actually had casualties of the Trinity test, and they were our babies. And when medical staff people contacted the Manhattan Project scientists, they said they would get back to them. And when they got back to them after consulting with their legal departments, they decided to deny and said they had been looking at statistics and they weren't seeing any spike in infant mortality and they weren't seeing anything to be concerned over, and there was nothing to cause concern. And so the government had an opportunity at the time of the test to evacuate the people that lived in the communities that were 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 miles away, and didn't do that. And then they had another opportunity when they were contacted and asked about the infant mortality to intervene and do something. The truth is, nothing has been done ever. There's never been an epidemiological study. I have heard sort of anecdotally that the government came back and took water and soil samples for many years afterwards, but none of that has ever been reported on. And the people here have suffered a great deal. There's many, 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 many families with huge numbers of cancers. I'm the fourth generation in my family to have cancer. I had thyroid cancer. My dad died from cancer after having 3 different cancers that he didn't have a risk factor for, except to the extent that he was a child living in a downwind community. My sister's undergoing treatment for skin cancer right now. Both my grandmothers had cancer, and both my 2 of my great-grandfathers had cancer in 1955. But my family is not extraordinary. Some families have had far worse effects from this. And so that's what I would like to share about what this has been like for us. We know there were tens of thousands of people living in a 50-mile radius to the Trinity site. And when it was all over, they said, we can never do this here again because we've so overexposed people to radiation. And if we do it any place, we have to find an area with a 150-mile radius uninhabited. And that's how they decided to go to the Nevada test site. And if you draw a radius around Trinity, 150 miles, it actually would then encompass hundreds of thousands of people, because it would encompass the cities of Albuquerque to the north and El Paso to the south. And so I think that that's a pretty good summary, and I'll defer to questions that people might have, specific questions that they might have.
Has there been an attempt to, has there been a specific request to the government to do an epidemiological study on it? I'm surprised that they haven't done anything whatsoever.
Well, we have requested an epidemiological study. The 2 things that we know of that have taken place is there was a 10-year study called the Los Alamos Historical Document Retrieval and Assessment, or LAHADRA study for short. That was paid for by the Department of Energy and commissioned through the CDC. They hired a private contractor that had access to everything that was unclassified after the Manhattan Project and the Trinity test. And the purpose of the LAHADRA study was to take a look at the releases associated with Los Alamos Labs specifically. But I was told by one of the investigators that the elephant in the room was the Trinity test. And there is one investigator that spent 10 years on that study. His name is Dr. Joseph Shonka, and he has actually formulated a series of slides that he's distributing and that he's lecturing with right now, because he wants to correct the false narrative that no one lived here and no one was harmed. He actually now refers to the Trinity test as not a test, but a nuclear disaster, because he believes that the exposures were 10 to 100 times greater than anything that's taken place anywhere in the world, including Chernobyl, Fukushima, the Nevada test site. There was also a recent NIH study, a dose reconstruction that was started maybe 5 years ago, and we understand that that dose reconstruction is complete. But imagine trying to do a dose reconstruction 70 years later. Dose reconstructions rely heavily on people's memories of what they ate, where they got their water, etc. And there's not a lot of those people left to discuss those sorts of things. And so we're sort of anxiously awaiting the NIH study and their findings and their dose reconstruction. But those are the only two studies that we've ever known of. In the chapter 10 of the La Hadra study dedicated to Trinity, they have surmised that the test actually exposed some people to what they said was 10,000 times more radiation than what's considered acceptable today. And of course, that's a factor of people living so close to the test site. Exposure to radiation is a factor of distance and time, and because we lived so close to the test site, and because the test produced such huge levels of fallout, then you would expect people to have much higher levels of exposure than any place else.
Tina, could you say just a word about the radiation, it's called the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act, just an outline of it? Because I remember you telling me when I was at ANA that downwinders from the Nevada tests have been included in the RECA, but you all have not yet been included for compensation. And why is that?
Great question, Robin. I will answer your question with what I know. The Radiation Exposure Compensation Act was a bill passed in 1990, 30 years ago, to compensate the people downwind of the Nevada test site. What we know now is that New Mexico was actually downwind of the Nevada test site as well. And what's just bizarre is that the compensation ends right at the Arizona-New Mexico border, and I always say that it's as if there's a lead curtain there that somehow offers us protection. If you live 5 feet into Arizona, you get compensated. If you live 5 feet into New Mexico, you're not considered for the compensation. It's absurd. And so we know that we received high levels from Trinity and then regular dosing through the summer of 1962 from the Nevada test site, and yet we have not been included. Exposure to radiation is cumulative, so we continue to get these low doses and low doses and low doses from Nevada. And it's really unfortunate that I don't think when Congress passed these bills, they relied very heavily on science or what they knew to be the truth. But we've not been included. And we're the first people exposed to radiation any place in the world, and there have been bills entered for 10 years in Congress to amend the RECA program to include us. And we've had 2 hearings, one in the Senate Judiciary, one in the Senate Indian Affairs Committee, and there's never been a vote, no hearing in the House ever. That House Bill 3783 is critically important to us. And what we tell people is you need to contact your congressmen and women. You need to contact your House members and your Senate members. You need to tell them that this is very important to you. It's a moral and an ethical issue. It's very simply a moral and an ethical issue. It's absolutely unjust and unfair to take care of one group of people but not another. And so that's what we are pushing for. I will tell you that regularly in DC, they tell us that there's not enough money to include us in the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act, which it only adds insult to injury for us. And that we will not accept any longer. They pass trillion-dollar bills all the time in defense spending and to build more plutonium pits, which we actually never will need, but yet they won't add us to RECA.
I
have a question.
Let me just add a detail, which is looking up that act, there are some 30 sponsors of it. The progressive people in the House, but our representative was not listed. So those of you from Vermont, you have an assignment to call in to Peter Welch. Was there another question here?
Yeah, I had a question. I'm Dorothy Van Soest from Seattle. And my question has to do with, were there soldiers at the test site And is there support from the National Association of Atomic Veterans for the bill and for your efforts? I mean, divide and conquer, you know, there's enough money for Nevada, but there's not enough money for there's enough money for the atomic veterans, but you know, is there an effort or any success in coming together with the others affected by the radiation?
The answer to the question is absolutely yes, and we do have a lot of support from other organizations, and so yes, there's absolutely you know, reasons to collaborate with other people, and we do all the time.
Tina, Felicia and Jack are asking if, you know, if soil testing has been done.
As I mentioned, we have heard anecdotally that the federal government sent people back here for many years afterwards to take soil and water samples, but that's never been reported on. And obviously that makes me very suspicious. But having said all that, we've always wanted to maybe try to find a grant or something like that we could do it ourselves. I know if we opened up some of the old cisterns, there would remain plutonium there. And in the sand and soil also. I mean, that stuff settles out, and through natural, you know, erosion, etc., it's going to go deeper into the soil, but it remains there. There's no doubt about it. Another thing to remember is that the White Sands Missile Range is a test site. And while they never tested a nuclear device there again, they continue to detonate explosive devices out there all the time. And I interviewed a couple of gentlemen recently who were working on a crew that did the photography during some of those tests. And they were telling me that they remember the last test they worked on produced a crater. Mind you, the Trinity test didn't produce a crater that was of any significance. But the test they worked on produced a crater that was 12 stories deep, and they sprung water. So every time they detonate something out there, they resuspend particulate matter. New Mexico's infamous for dust storms here. And then it redistributes all of that radioactive debris over those towns again and again. So soil sampling would be incredibly important. If they don't have the political will to pass, you know, the amendments to RECA, it's doubtful that they'd ever have the political will to send somebody back here to take soil samples.
And just to mention, in Denver, they also did some testing of dust that they got out of very old attics. So that's perhaps in attics and barns where maybe the dust has not been disturbed much for 75 years.
Wow.
I actually have a vacuum cleaner bag full of dust from an old attic that I had somebody collect for me, and we've been saving it for the purpose of someday testing it.
Wow. Well, if there aren't more questions right now, we can have more questions later, but I'd like to introduce Joni Arends. Joni lives up in Santa Fe, and she serves as the Executive Director of Concerned Citizens for Nuclear Safety. She obtained a degree at the Vermont Law School in 1998, and I just want to point out that this is one of the first law schools to provide a degree in environmental law. So ever since J. Robert Oppenheimer chose to build the Los Alamos nuclear labs on the deserted mesa north of Santa Fe, and then to explode the first nuclear bomb in southern New Mexico, the state has found itself the most radioactively contaminated state of the Union. Joni's work focuses on all of this, the uranium mining, the storage, as well as the lab up in Los Alamos. And she focuses on the environmental, civil rights, and public health issues surrounding the Department of Energy sites in New Mexico. What a big job. Thank you, Joni, for all your work, and please tell us more.
Oh, thank you so much, Robin. I want to begin with an acknowledgement of place that I am on the lands of the Tewa, the Tiwa, and the Towa peoples here in northern New Mexico. I acknowledge this place as the ancestral lands of these peoples. And I want to thank Robin and Ellen of WILPF for their work to make this event happen. I'm grateful to the Vermont International Film Festival and WILPF for this opportunity to speak about the nuclear industry's occupation of New Mexico. And Ellen, I don't know if you can put up that simpler map. That would be helpful, so that while I'm talking about just giving a brief overview of what's happening in New Mexico would be very helpful. It's important to know that New Mexico is the 5th largest state in the country, after Alaska and Texas and Montana, California. Help me, Tina. Did I say Montana? Or New Mexico is the 5th. So just to give you some idea of this, where we are. So this map is of New Mexico, where the nuclear industry has occupied and continues to occupy. So since the days of World War II, the industry came to New Mexico. It began with uranium mining, hauling, and milling. And exposure to radiation causes cancer as well as kidney problems, because uranium is both radioactive and a heavy metal. In the spring of 1943, the U.S. Manhattan Project removed homesteaders at gunpoint on the Pajarito Plateau, which is where Los Alamos lab is below Taos on this map. They established Project Y to design, research, develop, and fabricate the first plutonium bomb. They called it the Gadget, and that was the bomb that was tested at the Trinity site. After the war, Project Y became the Los Alamos Scientific Laboratory, and then the Los Alamos National Laboratory, which it's known as today. It's located 25 miles northwest of Santa Fe, and Santa Fe is the capital of New Mexico. Tina told you eloquently about the Trinity tests, so I'm going to go forward and talk about the administration's proposed budget for Llano for expanded plutonium pit production, which is the cores of the nuclear weapons, the triggers for nuclear weapons. For the next 5 years, they're estimating to spend $6.4 billion. This is twice the amount that they estimated just 3 years ago. This includes fabrication of the radioactive triggers, and it includes infrastructure and other work there. It includes hiring 1,500 more people. The National Nuclear Security Administration, which is a semi-autonomous agency within the Department of Energy, wants Llano to fabricate 30 plutonium pits per year. They are also proposing that the Savannah River site refurbish, finish, modify the mixed oxide fuel fabrication facility at the Savannah River site for fabricating 50 plutonium pits a year. This is it's a very, very expensive project. It's important to know that the Savannah River site is located on the Savannah River in South Carolina, but it borders the Savannah River in Georgia as well. And there's a lot of environmental justice issues there because the Shell Bluff folks live right across the river from the Savannah River site. The full committee of the House Energy and Water Appropriations Bill, which includes funding for DOE, passed the full committee today. It will go to the House floor later this month. The Senate bill has not yet been issued, but this bill is a place where we can make change with regard to these astronomical amounts of money for pit production. Back to New Mexico. In 1970s, there was a great need for a disposal site for the plutonium contaminated, what they call defense-related waste, because the Department of Energy works on the nuclear weapons, which are considered defense waste. As Tina said, weapons-grade plutonium must be isolated from the environment, and it has a half-life of 24,000 years, which means that you have to protect it from the environment for almost 250,000 years. And human exposure is through ingestion and inhalation, and of course it causes cancer. So the waste isolation pilot plant, which is down in the southeast corner of the state, it was constructed in the salt beds of southeastern New Mexico, 2,150 feet below the surface of the earth. And after CCNS, my organization, Southwest Research and Information Center of the state of Texas, the state of New Mexico, filed suit and obtained an injunction to keep WILPF closed for nearly 11 years. The injunction was lifted, and WILPF was opened on March 26, 1999. Now, the permit that allows WILPF operations said that it would operate for 25 years. So WILPF is supposed to close in 2024. There are plans to expand WILPF to, first it was 2048, and now it's up to 2080. It's hard to say that, 2080. So we're calling it Forever WILPF, because the promises that the Department of Energy told us back in 1999, when I was, much younger, that they would operate for 25 years and it would be a very confined project. 25 years, we're going to fill it up, we're going to close it, it's all going to be good. Now they're saying that they want to expand it. So they're proposing a new shaft down into the underground, 2,150 feet below the surface of the earth. So I want to say that the help of people, the more information we can get out there about these two plans to expand pit production at Llano and expansion of WILPF, because they're related, because they generate the waste at Los Alamos, and if they're going to expand pit production, they need someplace to put the waste. So that's why the relationship between the two sites, and they're both in New Mexico. So we need your participation to oppose both of these projects. I also want to say that New Mexico is invested in the Palo Verde power plant in Arizona. So our taxpayers, our ratepayers are paying for that power plant as well. There's also 10 long-term stewardship sites in New Mexico, which means that long-term stewardship is a DOE term that means that they won't clean up the messes that they've made. These sites are located in Albuquerque. You can see, it's not listed there. Albuquerque, Los Alamos, there's 3 or 4 sites up there. In the Grants Uranium Belt, there's a lot of abandoned uranium mills and mines there, as well as the White Sands Missile Range, which is below the Trinity site. Yes. And there's also 3 Plowshares atomic tests that took place in the 1960s. One is at the gas buggy site up in the middle of the state in the upper part. They exploded a nuclear bomb underground to loosen up the formation in order to get the natural gas out. And what they got was radioactive natural gas. There's also a site down here by WILPF called the Gnomes Test. So we have a lot of residual waste here. And then we have a lot of residual waste in New Mexico. And now we have 2 proposals for bringing consolidated interim storage to to New Mexico at the Holtec site and also at the WCS, which is Waste Control Specialists and Interim Storage Partners. The comment periods to the Nuclear Regulatory Commission are due in September for both of those on the environmental impact statement. And it would be great if folks here could write comments or sample public comments on various websites. And you can learn more by signing up to receive our weekly CCNS news update that we've been producing for 32 years. And you can do that on our website at nuclearactive.org. We also provide a weekly Did You Know that includes current events, an events calendar, and other resources. And I want to thank you so much for this opportunity to speak this evening.
Well, thank you so much. I mean, I think those of us out east here especially aren't aware of the impact of the nuclear industry, especially in New Mexico, but also Nevada, Utah, and so on. I think there's more awareness there, and maybe more support for it also because it generates jobs. Especially in the Santa Fe area. You know, one question I have, and then I want to hear everyone else's thoughts. So many bombs, nuclear weapons were demobilized after the end of the Cold War. And I'm just wondering where those plutonium pits went. In other words, why do they need to create more pits? Because they have all the bombs that were removed from action since the end of the Cold War. Do you have any idea? You know what I mean?
Yes, there's 15,000 plutonium pits sitting at the Pantex facility, which is north of Amarillo, Texas. And those are some of those pits. And so there's an argument to be made saying we don't need new plutonium pits because one pit can destroy so much that to invest in new nuclear weapons harms so many people. Yes, it's jobs, but what kind of jobs are they really? When we need the scientists to be working on cleanup technologies, on climate change, on the virus, there's so many other essential scientific projects that need to be worked on that we don't need to be making new plutonium pits.
Yeah, let me step in just a second. If since there's people asking how to get involved, can you tell us if this website that we put on the chat will have the information like maps that were shown here and which bills to support and so forth? Is that available, Joni?
Yes, yes. And you
Great.
can go to our website too at nuclearactive.org.
John, the Tularosa Basin Downwinders has a website also. It's www.trinitydownwinders.com. And everything that you would want to know about our work is highlighted there. There'll also be a link there up later this week because we're producing a 75th anniversary memorial that we do. Now with the virus, we can't do it in person, but we're going to have a video memorial on the 16th.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And for anybody who is wondering, there's a way to download the chat box. So if you don't want a copy from the chat box, because it'll all disappear when this goes away, it will be recorded for available later, the whole program. But the chat box, if you're looking for the website names and don't want to copy them, if you just put on the saved chat, there's a little option. Anybody know exactly where that option is?
The three dots.
The three dots near your name?
In the message part where it says save chat.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Or just copy. Thank you. That's very valuable information. Ooh,
yes.
Other questions?
I could ask another one. I'm just wondering from either Tina or Joni, what's the current political situation in New Mexico. I know you have a wonderful representative in the Tucson area, I think, or maybe he's left, Garvolia or something, who I think was very concerned about the nuclear issue and seemed to be a progressive person, but has the industry been able to kind of buy up the politicians in New Mexico?
Do you want to take that one, Tina?
Well, we're blessed actually to have 3 representatives and 2 senators who all support our efforts 100%.
Wow.
And have been working. They're all Democrats. They've all supported us 100% in our efforts. We also have a governor and a lieutenant governor. Our governor, Michelle Lujan Grisham, was a member of the House of Representatives prior to being elected governor. She supports us 100%. So our particular delegation supports us with everything that they have. The problem is we have a split, Congress. And, we can get the bills passed, I think, through the House, but we still have to get them passed through the Senate. And there has to be political will to do that. And the terrible thing is we're assigned to the House and Senate Judiciary Committees, and I don't have to tell everybody about how busy they are now with all of the issues that have developed out of this administration. And so we're sort of happy to report that we've got full support here, but we need full support from the senators and the representatives from all over the country. That's why being able to speak to you all is so important to us, because you guys can lobby your representatives, your senators, and it would be helpful to us. If they signed on, it's helpful to us. If they signed on to the bills. I think Joni might be able to answer the question about whether the nuclear industry has been able to buy our politicians, because in some regards that does happen, and I think Joni would be better suited to answer that question if she'd like.
Okay. So Senator Udall is retiring this year, and Ben Ray Lujan, who is the representative, will be moving into his seat after the election. Senator Heinrich has been a very active supporter of all things nuclear weapons, and we're going to have some work to do, because right now he's a junior senator and he'll become the senior senator. Deb Holland, who is based in Albuquerque, has been a champion on so many different issues. And Representative Torres Small from the southern part of the state has taken some very strong stands about these proposals for spent fuel rods and also on WILPF. Her main concerns are the environmental impacts of such projects. I think it's really important to know that the Department of Energy budget in New Mexico is about $7 billion a year for Los Alamos, Sandia, and WILPF. And that's about the same amount of money that this year's state budget was, just to give you some perspective on where we are in all of this. So we need support, we need grassroots organizing to oppose these things. And as I explained earlier, we were able to keep WILPF closed for 11 years in the 1990s because of that grassroots activity. We're trying to rebuild it to oppose the proposed expansion.
And the reason it matters to all of us is that the waste is going to be shipped there on highways or by trucks or by trains. And that's when communities suddenly wake up and say, we don't want that to happen. Mm-hmm. And so that is a time for other people in other states to get involved. We should get involved before that, but I remember last time around when with the waste from Vermont Yankee, going out to New Mexico, and Bernie was kind of waffling about whether he supported it or not. I think he came out against it, and now the waste left over at Vermont Yankee is at Vermont Yankee. I think it's whole tech in barrels and so on there. So it's not moving. And so I think ultimately that has to be the solution.
On-site storage is the solution right now, because moving the waste to this consolidated interim storage facility, or a proposed consolidated interim storage facility in New Mexico, will require it to be moved again. And we're understanding that the canisters that they'll be stored in are thin-walled as opposed to thick-walled canisters that they're using in Europe. And so there's all sorts of different different standards that are applied to what things that happen in New Mexico. And also the danger of most of the waste, the spent fuel rods, would be shipped by rail. And we all know, if you've ever I've taken the train to Chicago from New Mexico, and you go through the backyards of so many communities, and those people will be exposed as those spent fuel rods travel past their homes or their backyards. So one of the things is we're working with Beyond Nuclear out of Maryland and the NIRS, the Nuclear Information Resource Service, to talk to people about that transportation, because it's very dangerous. It's also that the communities are not prepared with the necessary emergency response to prepare or respond to an accident involving spent fuel rods. So it's best just to leave things where it is. Of course, they always bring up the example of San Onofre, which is in San Diego on the coast. And those spent fuel rods could go into, move 5 miles inland to Pendleton military base there. And they could be watched and stored. They don't need to remain on the coast. And so I just want to give the caveat that I don't really work on nuclear power plants. I work more on nuclear weapons. So I might not have all of the key language here. But there's, Beyond Nuclear, the NIRS group, the Nuclear Issues Study Group in Albuquerque has a lot of information. They also have webinars. Their next webinar will be Thursday night about the whole tech proposal. And then there's a group in the Seeds, Sustainable Energy and Environmental something, Karen Haddon and Smitty, Tom Smitty have a group there that they're doing webinars as well about the proposed WCS, the Waste Control Specialist. And that's the place where the waste from Vermont Yankee went for storage.
Yeah.
Okay,
Joni, I'm going to interrupt you. I was looking at the time. I want to respect the fact that we agreed to an hour and let people know that those of us who want to stay and chat a little longer, that's fine to do so. But I wanted to give some summary comments and see how this fits in with the series. And I know there are 2 hands raised, and I'll get to those in just a minute, Tina and somebody from Wisconsin. So the most discouraging thing I've heard here, other than the awfulness of there's just no excuse for these weapons. If we just counted the cost that's been described here so well by you ladies, if people could just get that word out, and that was the purpose of the film series. The most discouraging thing I heard you say was our junior senator can't be pro-nuke enough. The younger generation does not know what these weapons can do, and the purpose of this film series is to show them what these weapons can do. This was a great start because it showed how we've already attacked Americans, and most Americans don't know enough about that to care. So it's a good start, but I would just encourage everybody to try to get the word out to people that aren't already on your side to watch more of these films, because my experience being an activist in this with PSR for so many years is if people will take even an hour to learn some of this stuff, they change their minds about nuclear weapons and stop going into this blind support for anything military, especially the ultimate military power, which is nuclear weapons. So before we get to those last questions with the hands raised, I want to see if anybody had any questions about the film. I have a few comments I can make about it, but if anybody wanted to comment on that. Because here we heard the victims who weren't talked to at all about it. They weren't warned about this. And then we had this film of the most brilliant brains in the world working furiously with unlimited resources and money and secrecy to do this to people. And the greatest point of the movie to me is almost all those guys, once they built it, said either don't use it, and if they once it was used, said never build another one, with the exception of Edward Teller and a couple others. But any questions about the movie?
Well, I found it interesting that they didn't talk anything about the people downwind or downstream of Los Alamos where they built it. They didn't talk about the harm done to any people around the Trinity test itself.
It's depressing, isn't it? Mm-hmm. It's almost a cheerleading session for more and more. Mm-hmm. And you know, the combination of this is what makes us safe from all the bad guys in the world, with this will also create jobs, is a really tough 1-2 punch for us to overcome. But the truth will overcome it. The best hope for me is the fact that things were much worse in 1980. All this harm was being done then. There was less awareness of it. And we had 70,000 nuclear weapons in the world. We got those weapons down to only 13,000, so we can destroy the world 20 times over instead of 200 times over. So I know we can make progress. But education like this is the real key. And these.
May I ask, Peace Action Wisconsin has had her hand raised for quite a while, and Tina also has had.
Thank you, Ellen. Let's do that. Tina, you want to go first?
Okay, my name is.
Okay, from Wisconsin.
All right, my name is Pam Richard, and I work with Peace Action Wisconsin, but I lived in California a long time, and I worked with Tri-Valley Communities Against a Radioactive Environment, which is in Livermore, adjacent to the nuclear weapons lab. So I got an education from living there. And one thing that somebody asked about was the how long do nuclear weapons bomb cores last? The plutonium pits can last for 100 years. They don't go bad. So there really is no actual need to produce any more of these plutonium bomb cores. However, they're developing novel new nuclear weapons with different designs of weapons that have never been tested. So this is opening a door in Nevada. And I don't know if you've heard of the Planet Act and other acts that are trying to prevent the funding to go forward to ready the nuclear test site in Nevada for future nuclear testing. Now, the Planet Act tries to stop all funding coming for the future, and there's another act in the House that tries to stop all funding to start nuclear testing again, past and present, so they don't try to go back into former years and take money and upgrade the Nevada test site where they've already been doing subcritical testing, but that's just below a chain reaction. So that's just a little bit of update on that.
Thank you. Thank you. Tina?
Well, what I wanted to say, and this, both what you said, John, and what I believe her name was Pam, just said, is a good segue for what I would like to say. So when it comes to testing of nuclear devices or the storage of waste, they always say it's safe, right? And it is right up until it's not, and then it's catastrophic. And if you think somebody's going to come back and take care of that, think again, because we've been waiting 75 years. And I think that's the relative point when we talk about these things. That's why we need to educate people about what's happened to communities that have been waiting 75 years for some level of atonement. And I was recently interviewed about this whole idea of starting testing again. And I simply said what I just now said, and what I want to know is who wants that in their backyard. And I remember I was at one of those Holtec hearings when they allowed people to come forward and give public comment. And this woman stood up and said something that I thought was maybe the most profound thing I heard there. And she said, how are you going to protect, and this was what she was saying to the people there representing Holtec, how are you going to protect thousands of miles of railways against a terrorist threat? And there is no way to do that. And if you've got canisters going on rail cars across this country, transporting high-level nuclear waste, there has to be some regard for how you secure that from a terrorist threat. I mean, I think it's the perfect storm for something like that. And like I said, it's perfectly safe until it's not, and then it's catastrophic, and no one's going to come back and take care of you. We've been waiting 75 years. I've been at this for 15 years, and they never do it. You know, we've been appealing to their better angels, and it just doesn't happen. And so, you know, I think everybody needs to educate themselves around that idea that we can't have nuclear testing again. We don't need more pit production, and we've got to keep the waste in the ground where it's at now. An interim site in New Mexico is never going to be interim. I can attest to that. Like Joni said, they promised that WILPF would close in 2024, and now they've extended it to 2080. So anyway, that's just what I wanted to say about that subject.
Thank you. So I think that the thing that keeps it all running is money, and they keep throwing larger and larger amounts of money. Depending on how you count it, it's anywhere from $40 billion to $90 billion a year. The U.S. alone, and the world spends a much smaller amount. The other 8 powers all build. So cutting the money is the single most important thing, and there are some bills in Congress to do that we'll talk about in much more detail as the film series goes on. Pam, if you had specific information about what you were talking about on testing and wanted to put that in the chat box, if you have it. But I hope people will stay with us for some more of this series. The movies are very, very educational. So I see.
Mark Pendergast has a question.
Yeah. Go ahead, Mark.
Unmute yourself, Mark.
It's astonishing to me that they're contemplating resuming any kind of nuclear testing. Was this done under the Trump administration? Would it go away if we get rid of Trump?
Well, you know, atmospheric nuclear testing ended in 1963 when so much radioactivity was showing up in the bones of children all over the world. And then the all nuclear testing negotiation was done with the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty that went into effect around the world, actually not officially, but most people just stopped testing around 1996, the only exception being North Korea since then. So just in the last, I think, month, the Trump administration said, well, let's go test again for the first time to do underground actual explosive testing. I mean, it would be a huge step backwards, not unlike other things that have happened in this administration, but everybody has to scream at the top of their lungs, no, and the way to stop it is funding. There are 2 House bills right now that if you go to the PSR website, there's information, well, somebody has information about the 2 bills that just cuts, it allows money, of course, but then says absolutely no explosive nuclear testing with this. But cutting the money is the bottom line to everything, and just work with your congressman. No funding for nuclear weapons is the single most important thing, because as long as there's money, somebody will figure out a way to do it and explain it away and why it's not harmful and how we'll take care of it. Joyce, I'm going to end the meeting officially so anybody doesn't feel bad about signing off, because I think we advertised an hour. But I'm willing to stay and answer questions along with anybody who wants to. So we have someone else.
Yeah, I'd like to say something, Robin.
Go ahead.
Yeah. I mean, what needs to happen is to reach the young people. They're talking about defunding the police. Well, if you're going to defund the police, the origin of the permission of violence comes from militarism. So we need to defund the military budget, and there is an effort there to reduce it by 10% that Bernie supports and others support. But, you know, the source of violence is nuclear weapons. I mean, that is the most terrible ability to destroy humanity that we exist, and that governments hold it in their hands. And if we could entice and empower young people also to see these connections, I think it would be very powerful for our movement.
Absolutely. Thank you, Robin. And is it Joyce that has a question? Hand up. Did I see somebody has a question? Okay. Any others? Any other questions from? Well, it's not good news.
Maybe Joni would like to have a last word, since she hasn't said anything.
Not a question, but a thank you, thank you, thank you.
Thank you, thank you. I wanted to just say that the treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons has 39 nation states that have signed and ratified it. Once 50 nation states sign and ratify, it goes into effect. And the work of the International Campaign to abolish nuclear weapons has been working on that for many years, and won the Nobel Peace Prize for that. I always, when I get down, I go and look and see how many nation states have signed on to the treaty, but we're getting closer and closer to it going into effect.
Fiji just came on. Yeah.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah. We'll talk about all those treaties after some of the movies. Just wanted to highlight the next movie is called White Disease in Czech. It's a 1937 film that's the only non-nuclear related thing on the series. And it does, what it shows is how easy it is to drum a population into war. It's kind of set as a copy of Mussolini or Hitler in the 1930s in Europe. But the interesting thing about it, they thought of this and how they could still get people to go to war in the middle of a pandemic. So it's an interesting fictional film with a lot of character, and it's kind of entertaining. And it helps us get to the question of why it's so easy to get people to support weapons war and even nuclear weapons when it's obviously so self-destructive. So that'll make for some great conversation. Any last minute questions? The chat box, if you want to save it, if you hit under chat, if you hit the little 3 dot thing near your name at the bottom, and if you push that and hit save chat, it'll save a copy to your computer if you want to take notes.
Right.
Any last minute questions?
I have one.
Go ahead.
I'm Isabella Predmore, and you keep talking about a film series, and I'm sorry, I don't know what you're talking about. Are you going to show more movies today?
No.
Oh.
Robin, you created a lot of confusion and did a wonderful thing by having this many people on the call. So I'm going to let Robin explain why you don't know about the film series.
Well, okay, this is a collaboration between 2 groups, and some of the film series people don't know what WILPF is, and some of the WILPF people aren't aware that there's this series. And it seems as though I'm the point person because I'm very involved in both of them here in Burlington, Vermont, where the film series got started. So on our WILPF e-alert at the end of it talks about the series, and you can click and see what's going to be shown in the weeks to come. It ends on Nagasaki Day. The event I'd like to highlight is the film Command and Control, and the speaker will be Bruce Gagnon, who runs the organization Space for Peace, and he knows more of what's going on in Trump's ideas of dominating from space. He knows more than almost anyone else I know. So I think that will be a very fruitful conversation. So just look around for it.
I just put in the chat box the website for the Vermont International Film Festival, and that'll show you exactly how to sign up for the series, the links to the films, and then how to register for the discussions like we had tonight. And Tina, did you want to talk again?
I just wanted to say that I saw in the chat, and I'm not sure how I can correct it, but in the chat it says that our website address is www.trinitydownwinders.org, and it's .com.
Okay.
So Eco Art Space is it was a nonprofit for 20 years, and in January, I'm in Santa Fe. I turned it into a membership organization. I've worked with artists addressing environmental issues for 20 years, well, really 30 years. And we have about 300 members, and one of our members is been very involved in nuclear issues. She wanted to hold something to honor the 75th anniversary, so we've created an event, a Zoom dialogue, about an hour and a half on the day of the Nagasaki anniversary on Sunday, August 9th at 11 a.m. Or actually, it's 10 a.m. I was going to change that.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, and I'd like to announce that our next Zoom call is on Nagasaki Day, and Ellen, maybe you can tell about that.
Yeah, Hideko Tamura Snyder, Dr. Hideko Tamura Snyder was a survivor of the Hiroshima bomb. She went to university in the United States and met an American that she married and lives on the West Coast. But she's written a wonderful book called One Sunny Day and started the One Sunny Day Initiative, I think it's called, and telling the story of her life before, during, and after the Hiroshima bomb. And so she has agreed to talk and tell her story on August the 9th, Nagasaki Day, at 6 p.m. Eastern Time. And we have posted the link to the Zoom call on the WILPF US timeline, and we have it as one of the events on the WILPF US Facebook page, and it's listed on the Disarm and Wars page, and I'm putting all those links in here. Mm-hmm. And it's going to be broadcast, the first half hour of it is going to be broadcast to thousands of people around the world on the 75th anniversary. So please join us.
Mm-hmm. And that's together. That's being put together by who, Ellen? Who is it that's doing that? How can we?
Gensikyo, and Rethink Media is coordinating it. Rethinkmedia.org.
Okay. Yes.
Mm-hmm. And perhaps before we go, Ellen, Cheryl, you might say a few words about the solidarity actions, because that involves a number of these different events coming up. Could you tell people what that's about?
The live streaming that you were talking about, 9 hours on the 6th of August and 9 hours on the 9th of August, which will be broadcast, we hope, widely. And we will, half an hour of our talk with Dr. Snyder will be part of that live streaming. There are 120 organizations who have come together to produce this live streaming event. Okay. And in fact, what you need to do is to go to www.hiroshimanagaSaki75.org. That is the website for this very large publicity about the need to get rid of nuclear weapons. And then under there, you'll see events, you'll see statements, you'll see actions, and that is an important place to be on the 6th and the 9th of August. The branches of WILPF, so WILPF is a US section of WILPF International, which has its membership all over the world. It's a 105-year-old organization, the oldest women's peace organization in the world. And we have about 40 branches within the United States. And every so often, all the branches focus on one theme at once. This year we are focusing on the 75th anniversary of the dropping of the bombs and the 75th anniversary of the creation of the United Nations. So this is a very unusual juxtaposition of events. So while a lot of the world was fighting each other, first in Europe and then in the Pacific theater, a whole bunch of people, diplomats, met in San Francisco, which is near where I live, in our opera house, and they hammered out that there should be a new organization called the United Nations, and it would have a charter that was all to do with peace and not having war. And so simultaneously, these two things were going on. A terrible war was happening. Terrible weapons were being developed by the Manhattan Project, dropped on unsuspecting civilians in Japan, and unsuspecting civilians in New Mexico also suffered from the Trinity test. At the same time, people were planning for peace through the United Nations. And we have a timeline that that Robin and I and Charlotte created that takes 25 dates in 1945, important dates, and explains to you what was happening on that date and what it meant at the time. And then you see, as you go through our timeline, how the world history was changed by a variety of happenings. And the Manhattan Project was one of those things that was happening. It has been said that we dropped the bombs on the Japanese in order to not to have to invade Japan, which would have cost a lot of soldiers to be killed. We knew how furiously and fiercely the Japanese soldiers would fight, having taken over the island of Okinawa. Some people claim that we actually never needed to drop those bombs, that the Japanese were very close to surrendering, that they knew that the USSR was about to enter the war and invade them, their properties in Manchuria. And so it was only a matter of time before they would have surrendered. So we try to tell this story in the timeline, and I think you should all try and visit it and look at each of these 25 dates and see what was happening in 75 years ago, and how remarkably these two stories were going on together. And our WILPF branches are focusing on that. And I know that there are people from WILPF on this call, and part of the solidarity activities are to educate yourself better about what happened 75 years ago, and to know the real stories, not what major media might try to tell you. And therefore, hopefully this will give you the impetus to work against nuclear weapons nowadays and to get them abolished, broken down. You can dismantle a nuclear weapon. It's doable. We've done it in the past. So please go visit, and a whole bunch of information about the Trinity bomb test. I try to explain to you, I'm a physicist, I try to explain to you why they needed to test the bomb, how a nuclear bomb works. So thank you very much, Joni and Tina, for telling us about the after effects of the test in New Mexico. That is really quite a secret. It was highly secretive then, and many Americans don't know it ever happened. Thank you for telling us about it.